Hey YouTube, this is Evan Magician 34 and I have this week's edition of The Edge. I'm not going to be talking about a specific card this week though. This week I'm going to talk about something that some of you may already know about, and if so, then you may not necessarily want to watch, although you might want to pick up any pointers you may not know. But if you don't know what this is about card advantage, then you definitely want to stick around. It's one of the leading theories of gameplay and helps engineer good play. Now for instance, let's say my field is something like this. And I've got 3 cards on the field, 2 monsters and 1 back row, and I have 2 cards in my hand. And these are all the cards I control other than my deck and my graveyard. These are active cards that I can use, essentially. I have 2 monsters, 1 spell or trap card that's set, and 2 cards in my hand. This means that my card count is 5 cards. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I have 5 cards. Now to determine card advantage, I look at how many cards my opponent has on his or her field. If my opponent had, let's say, 2 cards in their hand, 1 card set in their spell trap zone, and 1 monster, then they would have 4 cards total, and that's their card count. And since my card count is 5, I have card advantage on them, or I'm upping card advantage by 1 card. And the principle of card advantage is fairly simple. The more cards you have, the more general plays you have open to you, the more options you have, so the better your odds are of winning or getting to a winning situation. So card advantage is good. The more cards you have in your field and on your hand put together, the better. And or the fewer your opponent has. Basically, you want to have more than your opponent. And that's the theory of card advantage. And in fact, many of the best cards you'll find in the game have a lot to do with card advantage. Card advantage is basically the concept of quantity versus quality. Now, sometimes quality wins out, and we'll get to that a little bit later. An excellent example of card advantage is Elemental Hero Stratos. He's a monster, and just when you summon him, he lets you search your deck for a hero of some kind and add it to your hand. So he generates you 1 free card that wasn't there before. When he moves from your hand to the field, your card count is still the same, but when his effect resolves, you get an extra card that you didn't have before, so you're +1, which increases your card advantage. That's one of the reasons he's so good. That, and he lets you search for any hero, so it's a quality thing. You get what you want when you want it. Another example of card advantage, sort of in the reverse, is Breaker the Magical Warrior. You summon him, his ability activates, he gets a counter. So far, card advantage is the same as it was before. But when I take this counter off of him, I can destroy a spell or trap card my opponent controls. So my opponent loses a card. My field is still the same and I have the same number of things, but my opponent is down a card or -1. So ultimately, my number versus theirs has changed in my favor. They lost a card, so I'm 1 up from where I was before, essentially. So that's a good thing. Now, the easiest way in the game to generate card advantage is to attack and destroy a monster by battle. Because when I destroy a monster by battle, it leaves the field and goes to their graveyard. So I essentially generated a -1 for my opponent, which is the same thing mathematically as a +1 for me. It's the oldest form of card advantage, and it's why high attack scores are important. But there are some other ways to generate card advantage too. For instance, cards like these generate you potentially a lot of card advantage. For example, if I have 1 monster on the field with my Torrential Tribute set, my opponent already has 2 monsters and summons a third, by flipping Torrential Tribute, I destroy every monster on the field. My Torrential Tribute plus my 1 monster is 2 cards that I'm going to lose, so that's -2. But my opponent's going to lose all 3 monsters, so they're -3. Which means that he lost 1 more than me, so it's overall, or net, a -1 for my opponent. Mirror Force works similarly. If I use Mirror Force when 1 monster is attacking and destroy 1 monster, it's a 1-for-1, or a fair trade. Nobody gained or lost anything. But as soon as I destroy 2 or more monsters, I generate that much card advantage. If I destroy 3 monsters with Mirror Force, well then, I lost the 1 Mirror Force card that's no longer on my field, so that's a -1 for me. My opponent lost 3 monsters, so that's -3 for my opponent. So I netted -2 for my opponent, which is the same thing as a +2 for me, which is really good. The more card advantage you generate, the better. Of course, some cards can do both at once, like Shura the Blue Flame, for example. When he destroys a monster by battle, he's already -1 to my opponent. But then he special summons a monster from my deck that I didn't have before, generating a +1 for me, meaning that I just generated a +2, which is one of the reasons why he's one of the best Blackwings. Now, speaking of things like that, if I say I have these 2 monsters on my field, and I synchro summon These two guys go to my graveyard and I get one monster. So I minus one to myself. But the idea there is it's quality versus quantity, because I traded two smaller monsters for one bigger and presumably better monster. So even though I generated a minus one for the example of Gaia Knight, I probably destroy a monster by battle, minus one-ing my opponent, meaning that my minus one from the Synchro Summon and the minus one from battle from my opponent traded out and it became a 1-for-1 or even trade. And a similar principle applies when you summon something like an Xyz monster. I'm minus one when I overlay because these aren't technically part of your field anymore, but I have a higher quality monster, so theoretically he can do more to my opponent, or say use an effect to make my opponent lose cards, therefore paying for himself. One of the oldest forms of a quality card is a tribute summon. Summon Skull doesn't really do anything, and when I tribute, I lose a monster I had on the field, so it goes away, minus one-ing me, and I get this card which is already in my hand. So I'm minus one myself, but I get a higher quality card than the monster I tributed. So in theory, Summon Skull could, say, destroy a monster by battle once again and generate me some card advantage. Caius the Shadow Monarch is another tribute monster, but he actually works even better. I minus one myself, but then his effect will go off and remove from play a card, hopefully on my opponent's side of the field, generating a minus one for them, meaning that that card he removed and the card you tributed on your side of the field equaled out. And then you still have this 2400 point monster to sling around at your opponent, maybe even destroying someone by battle, generating you essentially a +1, which is a -1 for your opponent. Same thing. But let's talk a little bit about quality right quick. Pot of Duality is a good example of this. Pot of Duality is a card you simply activate, you look through 3, get 1. Well, Pot of Duality then goes away, so you lost a card. But you got a card from Pot of Duality, so it paid for itself. It's a 1-for-1, an even trade. So, like one card getting another card and trading out isn't necessarily very good for card advantage. But Pot of Duality lets you essentially get any one of 3 different cards to replace it, so it's much higher quality. And quality is what's important sometimes. And you can use it to essentially get other cards that could generate you card advantage. Now, Mystical Space Typhoon is another card when it comes to quality that's an interesting choice. When you flip it, or just activate it straight from your hand, you destroy one card your opponent controls. So inherently, in principle, it's a 1-for-1 trade. But you can actually use this card and cards like it to cheat out extra cards. For example, if you have this card set, and your opponent tries to destroy it with, say, their own Mystical Space Typhoon, you can chain it and destroy a different spell or trap that your opponent controls. So in the end, they'll lose their MST, which is destroying this MST, plus the card that you destroyed with this effect. So your opponent lost a card in that exchange, so you actually generated a +1 off of that. Of course, when you activate your own MST, you're open to the same vulnerability. Your opponent might chain the card and essentially generate free cards off of it because now you're paying your MST just to get rid of a card that now would go to the graveyard anyway. And that's one reason why chainable traps can help be good cards against common cards like MST. One reason why chainable cards, in other words, cards that can just activate any old time, not just at specific triggers, are often better choices for your deck. Cards like, say, Karma Cut versus Sakuratsu Armor. But Karma Cut's got a cost, and we won't bother with that right now. Now, DD Crow is another example of a good card, but which is inherently a -1. I discard this DD Crow out of my hand to get rid of a card in my opponent's graveyard and remove it from play. Well, their graveyard doesn't count toward their card advantage, so he's a -1. But more often than not, this guy can secretly gain you advantage. Reason being, you basically save him until your opponent needs that card, and then by activating DD Crow, you can steal away the thing they were targeting and they lose it. For example, if your opponent uses Monster Reborn and targets, say, Gorz the Emissary of Darkness in their graveyard, by DD Crowing Gorz, they no longer have a target for their Monster Reborn, so they lose their Monster Reborn. So DD Crow essentially traded with their Monster Reborn. Of course, quality sometimes is important for DD Crow too. If your opponent only has one light monster in their graveyard and many darks, and they have Blackluster Soldier Envoy at the beginning in their hand, or you suspect they may, or they find it, say, with their Pot of Duality, you might find it a good choice to DD Crow the light monster in order to prevent the Blackluster